So tonight, prayer for the country. If we've got extra time, happy to hear feedback as always about the class itself, things that we did not cover that you would love to see covered, perhaps in a very near future iteration of the course. And then next week, same time, same place, the proper closure to the class, unless the world brings us something else that we should be talking about in prayerful language, and then we'll study that too. It's nice to have this hold on the calendar. And for those who can't make it, we understand we didn't put it on your calendar in the first place, but we'll make sure that you have the recording. Okay, Rabbi James, I'm so glad you're here tonight. As a beautiful and fluid scholar and speaker of the Hebrew language. Something that Rabbi James and I wanted to highlight for everybody in the creation of this prayer, it's Hebrew gorgeously rendered by Rabbi Noah Satat, the director of the Israeli Religious Action Center, and always our very first stop when it comes to Hebrew poetry and Hebrew translation. Literally was just WhatsApping her today about what is the most literary variant of the LGBTQ community in Hebrew. She told me it's not Lehatav, the acronym for LGBTQ, but rather Kihilat Hagea. So you might see that in a future CBST Siddur coming your way. The prayer was written originally in English by Rabbi Cohen. And as a native English speaker, it is the language to which she reached first. Very soon thereafter, however, it was important both to Rabbi Cohen, to Rabbi Kleinbaum, and to the entire clergy team that the prayer be reflected in Lashon Kodesh, in this shared uniting language that all Jewish communities share, and for it to have that depth that is brought by the addition of Hebrew language, especially since so much of it is directly pulled from other Hebrew texts. So I am going to share on the screen just a version of the CBST Shabbat program in which we have the prayer for our country every single week. Rabbi James, before I do that, is there anything that you want to say about your connection to this prayer, about any introductory material you'd want our Lashon Kodesh students to know before we dive in?
Sure. So, I will say one funny thing. So I did not have a lot of time to look over this before tonight. And I've read it in Hebrew before when we've had people at CBST read it in Hebrew from the Bima, including when Rabbi Noah Satat has visited us. But one thing I really noticed as I was kind of going through that I hadn't consciously thought about before is that when an Israeli rabbi translates a blessing into Hebrew, there's a mix of modern and much more ancient Hebrew. Not only in the fact that there's two quotes from the book from Jeremiah and from Amos woven into the prayer, so clearly that's going to be biblical text, but that for Noah as a rabbi, she on one hand has the modern Hebrew in her head, and on the other hand has also studied these types of texts so deeply. It's sort of the equivalent in English if one wanted to write a blessing and had a mix of your kind of day-to-day street speech and something that sounded like Shakespeare. So when people write blessings today, but they use like thee and thou, and it often sounds a little, you feel like, well, wait, is this a modern blessing or an older blessing? That's sort of how the Hebrew winds up sounding, because we tend to dip into older forms of language. So I will say that because there are no vowels on some of this, and because it is very poetic, there are some words that I realized I'm not 100% sure, actually, which vowels to use. So if I say something and you're like, no, wait a minute, I actually know what that word is supposed to be.
Or I have a midrash on what it should be.
Or we have a midrash on what it should be. Yeah. But this is why actually Hebrew poetry, modern Hebrew poetry, is always written with vowels, because there's an assumption that you can't know what somebody's linguistic choice is going to be in something that is poetic. And that's the same for something that is a prayer, because there is very much a poetic element to it. That's what I got.
All right. So I'm going to share the text on the screen. And before Rabbi James jumps into the recitation of the prayer in Hebrew, number one, I want to make sure that everybody can see okay. Have I zoomed in enough? If Dorina and Andrea could be my guinea pigs, because you're the ones I see in my Zoom ribbon, give me thumbs up if it's clearly rendered or if it should be a little bit bigger. What do you think?
Good.
Looking good?
It's good.
Okay.
I think it needs to be a little bit bigger. I'm
A
sorry.
little bit bigger? Not a problem, Lisa. Let me zoom it just a bit. How about that? All right. And of course, if anybody has any questions before we dive in, virtually raise your hand or say it out loud. Otherwise, we will go through a full reading of the text, and then Rabbi James and I will return to some of our favorite Hebrew phrases or any questions that people might have about the phraseology. Go ahead, Jeffrey. What's your question before we begin?
I hope this is not going to sound stupid, but
It never does, Jeffrey.
how come there are no vowels under the Hebrew? There's no vowels under there.
I'm so glad you asked that question, Jeffrey. So as Rabbi James pointed out, this is written in modern Hebrew. It's not necessarily written in biblical Hebrew. And if you look, see the quote from Yirmiyahu down here, the actual biblical citation, starting with the word that has the vowels first. When it's lifted from Tanakh text, specifically from prophets, because that's where these citations are, you do get those Hebrew vowels, those nikudot. If we think back to when we were studying Rabbi Cohen's Al HaNisim prayer, and remember that the translation into English didn't give us the same quality in the Hebrew, where like you could decide how you were addressing God, with what pronouns, with what gender identity, were you keeping it consistent, were you changing it up as a prayer? What I like about this, though it drives Rabbi James berserk, because she's the one I asked to read it out loud, is that without the vowels, you do kind of get to choose your own adventure in the Hebrew. You're going to hear Rabbi James reading it with probably what it's meant to sound like, but it still allows you as the prayer a great deal of autonomy, how you pronounce the words, for those of us who are Hebrew readers and Hebrew speakers. It's the same, this idea of semiotics, that like when you put a piece of art out into the world, you do have a lot of control over it as its creator, but then it's kind of up to the viewer to interpret it as they will, to read significance into it that maybe you never intended for there to be. So too, if you leave that open quality with the Hebrew language and you don't necessarily fix it with all of the vowels, the prayer could literally say words to you that Rabbi Cohen and Rabbi Satat didn't necessarily intend, but could be perfect. Rabbi James, anything else you want to say about why there aren't vowels in this particular Hebrew prayer?
I think you named it, and I think it would be great to have a version with vowels, but that takes somebody who really knows what they're doing to add vowels to a text that is written without them. And as Rabbi Rapport said, for an Israeli today, the vast majority of people do not use vowels once they are past basically the third or fourth grade, unless they're poets, and even then they're only doing it for poetry.
All right, go ahead, Rabbi James.
Oh, and with gratitude to the two rabbis who made this blessing happen. Eloheinu ve'Elohei avotenu ve'imotenu, barech et artzenu ve'et kol hayoshvot v'hayoshvim ba. Yached levavenu lehodot lecha al chayenu ve'al hazman hazeh lihiyot derechot amitzim u'melei chemla. חזקנו וחזק ידינו כאשר אנו אחוזים בפחד. סייע בידינו לנתב את כעסנו לידי מעשה. חזק לבבנו לחוש את מלווה הפחד שלנו, כדי שלא נהפוך לאדישות. סייע לנו להפיע נדיבות על אחרים, כדי שנרים זה את זה. סייע לנו להיות צנועות בפחד, כדי שנדע כי גם כעסנו מרגישים פגיעות. יש אחרות הנמצאות בסיכון גבוה אף יותר. זוהי חובתנו הקדושה להיות עמם. ברכנו בטעם המתוק של החופש, כדי שנשכיל להעריך את החופש. לא זכינו בדורות קודמים ובעת הזו לרפא ולחזק את הדמוקרטיה שלנו, שתהיה כעץ שתול על מים, ועל יובל ישלח שרעשיו, ולא יראה כי יבוא חום, והיה עלינו רענן. שכינה אם כל חי, שלחי אורך ואמתך למנהיגנו, חזקה לבבותיהם שלא יתקשו, שישתמשו בכוחן כדי לדבר אמת ולפעול בצדק. מי ייתן כל יושבי הארץ יחלקו באושרה, ישגשגו בחופש שתצי, ויהיו מוגנים בחוקיה. מי ייתן באומה זו תשתמש בכוחה ובאושרה על מנת לקדם צדק, חופש ושלום לכל יושבי תבל. מי ייתן ונהיה חזקות ואמיצים, מי ייתן ונהיה נועזים במעשה ידינו ועמוקות במחלה שבלבנו, שנבחין מטה עלינו להקשיב ומטה עלינו לפעול. לעקור שנאה, גזענות, שוביניזם, אפליה, אלימות בכל צורה. לחגוג את צלם אלוהים בפנים שונות המשתקפות בכל המגוון האנושי, לקבל את הזר ואת המהגרת, ולכבד את המתנות שמביא כל מי שמבקשת מקלט בהזדמנות בארץ זו, כפי שהיה מאז לפי שאומה זו נולדה. ויגאל כמים משפט וצדקה כנחל איתן.
Amen.
Amen. Okay, I have to say one thing first. The words that are the hardest to read in Hebrew, and you may have figured this out already, are things like demokratia. When a word is taken from English and transliterated into Hebrew, and you're trying to figure out, you know how the Hebrew is supposed to work and how the vowels are supposed to work, and figuring those things out is always, the word that always throws me off to this day, even though I've read it a million times, is university, universitet, because it makes no sense in Hebrew. And it takes a while every time for me to figure out, like, universitet. Okay, got it. Always a problem.
And I think that this remains, it's highlighted for us because this is a perfect example. These are ideas and words that we are using contemporaneously. And so for right now, they make total sense. But imagine, Hebrew is an evolving and a living language. Even as it was sort of crystallized into these prayers over the course of time, that doesn't mean that it wasn't borrowing from all of these other languages, using loan words from other ancient Near East dialects, using loan words from medieval Romance languages from which it was surrounded, especially if things come out of certain parts of the Jewish universe that have roots beyond Hebrew. Maybe so many of the mysteries or the midrashim that we've come up with about like why exactly the words of this prayer are such have to do with, well, at the time it was demokratia, it was democracy, and all of us were on that same page. But we've kind of like, that doesn't make much sense as a Hebrew word. It doesn't follow any grammatical rules that we would associate with Hebrew. listen, 100 years from now, when people are, by God's grace, continuing to read Rabbi Cohen's prayer, maybe they will wonder, how am I supposed to pronounce that word? So what I would love to do is hear from people. We are so accustomed to receiving this prayer in the vernacular, in English, and what it was like for you to be hearing it recited in Hebrew, which is so much less commonplace at CBST, though we recite this prayer every Shabbat, evening and morning. And I'm going to start with Marcia. Marcia, this might not have been what you wanted to talk about because your hand was raised way before I asked that question, so you can say whatever's on your mind.
That's true. It was beautiful, and I kind of, fell at the ability to even do that. And part of it is, just the ability to read Hebrew without vowels. So, because that's something, I guess, if you live in Israel and you read the paper, you do every day. Okay, but my question was, my hand was raised because I was tantalized by what you said, Rabbi Rapport, about the choices that might be made. So I wondered if Rabbi James could select like a portion or a phrase and say, well, I read it this way. Did you read it that way because you knew what the translation was from Rabbi Cohen, or the original, writing, or did you make a choice of how you read it and what the grammar was of the, let's say, a particular phrase?
That's such an interesting question. I will say it's quite clear about how it's supposed to be read. But it's interesting because I will say that I'm so accustomed to hearing it in English, right? I feel like we're all so, we hear this and we just know it. It's almost embedded in our souls at this point. And the Hebrew is actually a little bit different. And part of that is because in order to make it sound more like prayer in Hebrew, doing a direct translation doesn't work as well as using more common sort of prayer forms in the language. Mm-hmm. So I'm just thinking of what's a really good, here's a good example. Okay, so near the end, when there are all of these, on the
screen.
Okay,
moment. Okay, here
great,
we go.
Great.
There you go.
Perfect. Yeah, stay where you are. Stay where you are. So like, so the whole section at the end where it goes into like, maybe be strong and have courage, to be bold in our action, to discern, to uproot, to celebrate, to welcome. There's all those things in a row that just sort of, it's like one really, really long sentence. That formulation does not work as well in Hebrew. And if you tried to directly translate that list of to discern, to uproot, to celebrate, to welcome with these long phrases after them, it would wind up sounding a little bit like a shopping list in modern Hebrew. Like it's a little too direct. So what Rabbi Satat did here is that a lot of these lines start with the words mi yiten. And you can see that there's at least, I think, 4 of them.
Yeah, 1,
mi yiten.
2, 3, 4. The other thing that Rabbi Satat avoided was having to put all of those verbs in the infinitive, but rather like gave the ability to conjugate them in the sentence.
Exactly.
By putting it into what's called the jussive voice. I've never heard the word jussive except for in linguistic reference. The jussive means that it is imperative, you are commanding somebody or something, but they're actually more powerful than you. So instead of like asking the Queen of England for a cup of tea, you would say, if it pleases your majesty to X, Y, and Z. What you see in the English, the way it's translated is, may all who dwell, may this nation. You see that a lot in Hebrew liturgy because it's really, we've got some chutzpah telling God what to do. However, how are we going to get our point across if we can't make some commands? So we use the jussive voice, and that's what Rabbi Satat is really brilliantly doing here. But Rabbi James, I sort of derailed you.
No, that's perfect, because that's the thing. The mi yitin, that formula, which is basically saying like let the one who gives all things. I mean, I'm trying to figure out how to really translate that in a way that makes sense, because it's like me is like who, right? Me, like who did what? Me. But it also really means like the one. Like the one who did such and such a thing. So me is this very short way, like it literally translated just means who. But in a poetic context, you're saying like the one who, yitin, like the one who will give, the one who will.
Yitain there is the verbal tense is future tense. So who will give? It means that you're not depending on that action happening because it hasn't happened yet. It's not the
And also,
of.
yeah. And also sometimes in biblical Hebrew, that is actually very confusingly how the past tense is formed. So mi yitin, actually, if you read it with a slightly more modern ear, it's future, may the one who will give. But if you read it with sort of a much older biblical sense, there is, in biblical Hebrew, sometimes those tense endings and not just the endings, the beginnings and the endings, the extra letter that gives the tense, sometimes those are actually flipped around in biblical Hebrew. So in a way, it contains both like the one who has given us, but also the one who will give.
Yeah.
It's not a formula that people use in like if I was going into a cafe in Israel to order a cup of coffee, I would not say, may the one who gave me cappuccino in the past grant me cappuccino today, right? You would just be like, what are you and to be honest, when I arrived in Israel for cantorial school, that is pretty much what my Hebrew sounded like, because I had not really studied modern Hebrew. Like I mostly knew Hebrew from from the prayer book and from the Bible. And so when I tried to speak Hebrew, I often had Israelis laughing their heads off at me, saying, you sound like a dead prophet. So you would never say mi yitin the whatever in modern Hebrew, because people would look at you and just be like, wow, what century are you from? We're so glad you're here.
So we have noted a Zoom update, which has hidden your raise hand function. It's no longer, helpfully separate. It's under all kinds of reactions. You can shoot a party popper, clap your hands, or raise your hand. So if you're looking to raise your hand virtually, you'll find it under the reactions tab. And I saw Ira's question in the comments, but now that Ira has the ability to virtually raise hand, we're going to go with Leslie and then Ira. So Leslie, what is your impression? What is your question?
I also want to say thanks for that beautiful reading. Rabbi James, it really was inspiring. And thanks for Marcia for bringing it out. I have a much more mundane question. What's the samech ayin at the beginning? It looks like some kind of an elision or where it begins up there.
There. Samech
ayin. Oops. There's a bunch of them. Samech ayin bi'adenu, it looks like, or that.
Oh, it's not a contraction.
It's not.
Yeah, those are yuds. Those aren't a chupchik. Those aren't an apostrophe mark. So it's the verb like to give assistance.
Yeah. So it's like sayeh biyadenu. It's like give help in our hands. Like put the assistance that we need in our hands to do the list of things that we're asking for the help doing.
Yeah, because you would expect a more like a more straightforward way of saying help would be la'azor, the infinitive, to help me. Ozer Yisrael b'tifara, the helper of Israel. And this is more like the enabler. It's really interesting that it gives us much more control over the actions. That God isn't simply like placing it in our hands, but nor is God, as we say in the words of Oseh Shalom, like the maker of peace. And so make peace for us here on earth. Mm-hmm. Good eye, Leslie.
And if you look down a few lines, 1, 2, 3, 4, like there's two more of them there. The second one, yeah, exactly. Sayeh lanu lihiyot tznuot b'pachad. So sayeh lanu, help us. Lihiyot, to be. Tzenuot, so tzenua can be like modest. but also like to shrink.
Yes.
You know, it kind of has these different pieces to it. Bepachad, in fear. So help us to shrink our fear, to be humble in our fear. It's a very lovely way of translating that.
And what's interesting is that when, so Rabbi Satat had her work cut out for her. Thank God she's such a genius in all of these languages. She is given a text in English, and she is drawing on all of the possible ways that she could translate it. Remember, my favorite sentence to say out loud: every translation is an interpretation. And she's purposefully building in as many literary allusions as possible to biblical references. So immediately I start thinking about a quote from another very famous social justice prophet, the prophet Micah, who says, what does God ask of you? But to walk humbly in God's ways. And that sense of, humility and modesty is not perfectly rendered in the English humble, but immediately when I see that word, I am transported to the book of Micah, which is the magical quality of reading in a language that you feel a deep sense of familiarity and love for. All right. Ira, go right ahead.
Thanks. Well, you saw the question, but I was curious as to what the thinking was behind including the nikudot in the two biblical quotes when they don't appear anywhere else.
Inverse of Jeffrey's question. It's perfect. Jeffrey says, why are there no vowels? And Ira says, well, why are there vowels? So, and what's really fascinating here is the Torah is written without vowels, right? So if we were being really Torah-itic, we would not have those vowels.
Right.
This is, it's a good question that I'm just going to tell you I don't really know the answer to, but here's my midrash, and then we'll hear if Rabbi James has a midrash and if other people have a midrash. I saw in the comments somebody said, it's to preserve, to make sure you actually pronounce the words the way that they are written in Torah. And so since the Masoretes so kindly gave us all of those vowels, gave us those trope marks to teach us how to sing them, and also like phrased them for us by literally giving us punctuation, otherwise the Torah would be one entire run-on sentence, we are honoring that level of tradition. Even though we recognize that originally, first of all, the Torah was probably entirely oral, right? These are stories that are being told over and over again that are eventually written down, and who knows, through the games of telephone that they had to travel in order to get to the Sefer Torah that we know today. But it is considered honorific when quoting directly from Tanakh text to use the vowels to make sure that there is no confusion. There is no semiotic imperative that like you can't decide how to pronounce these words of Torah. You have to go with what the Masoretes decided for us. But Rabbi James, do you have a different midrash on the subject, or any other?
I think my super practical answer is that, like, I guess flipping around what you just said, Rabbi Rapport, is that, right, the Masoretes wrote the vowels for us. That's a long established tradition of what those vowels are. When somebody who is Israeli, who is not regularly writing poetry and is not super fluent in how you add the vowels to the text, translates a text like this, the instinct is going to be to do it without vowels. It just takes a lot less time. And the assumption for an adult Israeli is like, who needs vowels? You don't even think about using vowels once you're an adult, again, unless you're writing poetry. So my assumption is that Rabbi Satat translated this, that we wanted to have it relatively quickly. And that we simply, if we would like vowels in there, we would need to either ask Rabbi Satat if she would have the time to add the vowels, and then we might actually need to ask like a scholar of Hebrew to double check that the vowels are correct, because it's just something that it's not common.
Additionally, it's a really clear and easy visual way to offset the quotations versus the original composition. Right? Just by looking. And this is what's so exciting. If we hadn't studied this in class, friends, would you have looked this deeply into the Hebrew to notice that some of it had vowels and some of it didn't? But now, as scholars of this text, through a simple scan, a gloss, you know exactly where in the Hebrew something is being quoted versus something is the words of Rabbi Cohen as translated by Rabbi Satat. That's pretty cool. Meant to lower Ira's hand. I'm gonna bring our shared screen down, and still eager to hear, what was it like for you as participants regularly in CBST services to hear this prayer in Hebrew? What did it do to you? Was it the exact same experience you've always had hearing the words of this prayer?
I could answer that question too, actually.
Great. I also see Ira and I see Jeffrey.
Great.
But let's start with Rabbi James, and then I'll call on those folks. And if there's anybody who hasn't yet spoken who would like to share impressions, you always get to go to the front of the line. Ooh, like Lisa Brown. Okay, go ahead, Rabbi James, and then Lisa, and I'll work my way through.
So I'll say one interesting thing about reading the Hebrew is that already in the first line, first of all, starting out by invoking our ancestors, right? God of our imotenu va'avotenu, is not something I'm used to doing before blessing this country. And it somehow sounds different in Hebrew when I'm doing it in the ritual language than if I'm doing it in English. I feel like I'm going straight into a Hebrew prayer. And so then that's followed by Barech et artzenu, bless our eretz, our land, which in a Hebrew context, you know, if we're doing a prayer for the state of Israel, we say Medinat Yisrael. And so here for the United States to be saying, you know, bless our land, something about that whole beginning formulation puts my brain into like a different space of prayer space, where I'm like, wait a minute, which land am I talking about right now? So it's interesting, you know, she didn't translate it as bless the United States, right? She didn't try to make it more specific by adding in the assumption that this would only be used in the US. But the way that hits, you know, my ear and my soul actually feels a tiny bit confusing when I'm doing it in Hebrew versus when I'm doing it in English. And I'm like, well, yes, of course, I mean this land in this country.
But Rabbi James, I'm wondering if secretly Rabbi Satat did embed that into her choice of words. And, you know, like really what I should have done is say, Rabbi Satat, would you stay up late and like come to this class and tell us all about what you mean here? But since she translated it as Eretz, though it works for every single nation on the planet, the Hebrew name for the United States is Artzot Habrit. And so I think for me, immediately, I think of like, wow, this is a uniquely American prayer for the country. And yet it has these universal values in it, that balance between particularism and universality that we've talked about in a lot of our prayers. There are themes that could be grasped upon by a citizen of any nation, and yet so uniquely American. But we don't know. We have
and
to
also would have a special resonance for Israelis using it.
Yes. All right, Lisa, what do you think?
So, yeah, I think Rabbi James just put it so much more eloquently than I was going to put it, but I feel very similarly, not so specifically, but I have such an association of prayer with the Hebrew that it just feels it feels more prayerful to me in the Hebrew. I'm really glad that is the word homonyms, that word democratic, you know, that shows up. And I'm so glad to have that confirmed, because I struggle with all the English words too that get Hebrewized. You know, I can't, they're the hardest words, you know, is to get those. But I'm so glad that there aren't any except for that one word that kind of jumps out at you. So you really know, it's kind of funny thing, because there's that one word of democracy in there that anchors you in a very essential meaning of the prayer, but then that's it.
Oh, what a good ear, because you're right. You know, that is really the only loan word that Rabbi Satat used, and it's unique, right? There wasn't a Hebrew word for refrigerator, and there isn't a perfect Hebrew translation of like a system of governance in which there is a process of election in this way. Awesome. Thank you, Lisa. Jeffrey, you and then Ira. Go ahead.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
I found it I don't know if it's the way Rabbi James did it, but it felt very musical. I could see this as a song. And the way she said the word democracy, democratiza, I feel, it sounded Israeli, her Israeli accent started there, but that word, I noticed an Italian lilt when she said that word.
Fabulous.
But I feel like maybe, who knows, maybe we could do a song. Maybe they could do a song with that.
Pointed out, this is a Greek loan word, so
Yeah.
we have the Greeks to thank.
Hey.
Perfect. Thank you, Jeffrey. Ira, what did it bring up for you? Oh, sorry. I think I was asking you to unmute just as you unmuted yourself. So now you're muted. There you go.
Unmuted now. Thank you. A number of things were coming up for me. One is that I think, having heard it so many times in English, it actually then listening to the Hebrew, I was able to just sort of let go of the English because I know the general gist of the prayer. So I didn't have to understand every word in the Hebrew to know what was being said, and I could just really listen to the mellifluous sound of the words and the language. So thank you, Rabbi James, for that. The other thing that is really coming up for me big time is that hearing this now today with what's going on in Washington, I don't even have the words to say what's in my heart. It's just more than any other moment in the past 4 years. Today feels overwhelming, just completely overwhelming, seeing these images of the Capitol being stormed. It's like, it's so dystopian. And so hearing the prayer read in Hebrew or in English today is particularly wrenching and meaningful and poignant. And that's it. I have no more. I will break out into tears.
I am totally with you, Ira. And this is the way that I felt our class. Perhaps this is the first time many of us are coming together in CBST community today on a day that is, as you described it, so wrenching, and this feeling of desecration. I am sort of transported to a feeling I have always sympathized with but never empathized with, of how our people must have felt with the destruction of the temple, or a description of when the Maccabees re-entered the temple after it had been desecrated to try to create Chanukah Habayit, a rededication of the physical space, of the philosophical idea, and of the spiritual presence that is required to be able to be honest and open in prayer, and to be vulnerable enough to be connected through these words to the celebrations and the sufferings of other people who are our family by very near and very far definitions. And when we hear this prayer in Hebrew, which we don't often do, I'm going to quote a member of this class who doesn't happen to be here tonight, but one of my favorite things that Jeannie Heller has ever said is one of the powerful aspects of reciting prayers in Hebrew is, Ira, just what you described, the ability to let go, because it's not necessarily the language in which you are most comfortable. And therefore, being able to release yourself of the obligation of perfect comprehension, or for some of us, perfect pronunciation, or for some of us, like the feeling of anything at all, instead of just kind of the meditative sounds of the Hebrew. It brings us into a very different spiritual place than when we pray in a language over which we have complete command and control. And that's why, in particular, because these words have become so precious, because we've seen them with beautiful photo montages of which we're all standing in front of the Islamic Center at NYU holding signs of solidarity. We've heard them like lifted up to the stirring chords of Aaron Copland, a brilliant gay Jewish composer. And really, Rabbi Cohen hit on so much of what we were feeling. We have prayers for the country that extend back. This is a very old Jewish tradition to pray for the welfare of a country, and in a sincere way, not the fiddler on the roof, like may God bless and keep the czar far away from us. But to mean it sincerely, and especially as those of us who are Jewish Americans, the language of prayer that she brought to these words, I think is deeply profound. Other impressions or things
I will just say,
go ahead.
and I just wanted to say, Ira, like in response to that as well, when I was watching the news earlier, the thing that I got the most kind of fixated on was on CBS. They were showing somebody's video from inside the Capitol building in the balcony in one of the chambers, I'm not sure which one. And, with several people kind of in the balcony together. And one of them was a woman in a red suit who was clearly praying. And every now and then I could catch just a few words of like, be with us in this time. And so the commentator is talking, and meantime, I'm like, what is she saying? What is she saying? Is it a psalm? Do I know this prayer? What, and it, that was the thing that I found in a way the thing that caught my attention the most was like, I want to know what that woman's prayer is, and I want to be able to say amen to it. Yeah.
And I think part of the power here is that, prayer transcends language. We actually don't need a holy tongue at all. We don't need a vernacular. We can always answer amen. I would love to dive a little bit deeper into the Hebrew of this prayer. So I'm going to share the screen again. If anybody has particular questions, there are certain turns of phrases for me. And, the way I enticed Rabbi James to join us tonight was I said, do you want to just spend some time geeking out with me and people who love the language of prayer about how beautiful a prayer this is? So if you have any thoughts or questions about particular parts of the prayer, all you have to do is virtually raise your hand or just kind of cut in.
Rabbi Rapport, I think you froze.
Yeah.
Oh dear. Well, I will say a word while we hopefully get Rabbi Rapport back. And I will try to see, I am not a host, so I will not as easily be able to see hands being raised, but if you put questions in the chat, then I'll definitely see them. So I'll just, oh no, we lost her entirely, which means we lost the screen share. So I'll come back, I'll just read it out loud. I have my very low tech version in front of me. This idea of taking the language that is more ancient sounding, that is more prayer sounding. Yep, she just texted me. She's trying to come back. So one of the first books that I ever read in Hebrew was actually a translation of Pride and Prejudice. Because I thought to myself, okay, it was the first adult book I read as opposed to like a children's book that they brought us in class. I thought to myself, okay, I know Pride and Prejudice so well. And this is sort of what Ira was saying about being able to sort of sink into the Hebrew because you already know the English. I know the English of Pride and Prejudice so well. I can like recite chunks by heart since I was a teenager. And I thought, this is great. This is a book I can read in Hebrew for the first time. And I won't need to be looking up words every 10 minutes because my brain knows what goes in each sentence. But it was a little more complex than I thought because the author did something very similar to what Rabbi Satak did for this prayer, which is that to try to make the language sound a tiny bit more archaic, right? To give that taste to it of being an older text from an older time. Some of the translation actually used phrases from the Bible, like used phrases. They were trying to remember, there was one particularly good one about that a line about the, one of the girls making a sacrifice for her family. was translated into the Hebrew using a phrase from Leviticus about raising something onto the altar of. Right, and they could have just said sacrifice and used, there's a perfectly good Hebrew word for, just like making a sacrifice, but instead use this formulation from the Bible to give it a taste of being something older, so that it didn't just sound like a modern novel that happened to be by Jane Austen. So one of the things that I love is that the very beginning of this prayer, as I already said, this, starting it with Eloheinu ve'Elohei Avotenu ve'imotenu, our God and God of our ancestors, is really using this totally formulaic phrase from the prayers that we're used to hearing, at the beginning of the Amidah, for goodness sakes, right? That's just part of how we start prayer. But it continues, and it actually, in the beginning of the prayer, she really does make sure that she's using like liturgical Hebrew, rabbinic Hebrew, which is interesting because I will say that, in the Siddur, in CBST's Siddur, Rabbi Cohen actually, in her writing of some of the other prayers that we have, she actually writes fantastic liturgical Hebrew. It's one of her specialties. Rabbi Cohen is like the very rare rabbi who can not only, translate it to English and parse it out beautifully, but can actually write in rabbinic Hebrew, which is not a skill that even a lot of Israelis have. And so I think because Rabbi Satat and Rabbi Cohen know each other, like they're good friends also, and knowing that that is Rabbi Cohen's style, to make sure that it grounds in the sound of tradition, right? Even starting with the first few sentences, making it feel like, oh, I'm really seriously entering prayer right now. It says, excuse me one second, poor Rabbi Rapport is trying to call me. Let me quickly just answer her.
Carol, can you mute yourself, please?
I have an important message from the rabbi.
Hi, everyone. Thank goodness. I was so looking forward to meeting with everyone next week because the internet connectivity just went down in Kentucky. I have many things to say to Senator McConnell on this subject. Thanks for being patient about this, and I really look forward to meeting next week and to speaking about Kodesh, as was promised, a beautiful ending to our class. And I hope that many, if not all of you who are able, will join us at 8 tonight or 8:15 if you're attending Mariv for our community gathering, which will close with a reading of this prayer for the country in English this time. But now you know all the beauty and the depth that was poured into it. And thank you, Rabbi James, for bringing me back into class via your phone.
Oh, I'm really glad that you're not entirely gone. Right? So we'll just I will let you go, and we will just finish up this opening piece, and then I will let all of you go, and you'll all see each other next week, I hope. Bye, Rabbi Rapport.
Same bad time, same bad place, same Zoom ID.
Great, thank you. I'm really glad I was here. And also the mystery now is that apparently nobody is the host of this meeting. So we'll see, it may never end. It will just go on forever. Right, so the last thing I wanted to say about this is the fact that Rabbi Satat really front-loaded this very rabbinic Hebrew, so that, for somebody who is reading the Hebrew, for those of us who just, have a little bit of familiarity about how it sounds, we're starting with this Hebrew that's very familiar. It's stuff that we're used to hearing. Yached levavenu, unify our hearts. Lehodot lecha, to thank you. right? These are phrases that even if we don't know exactly what they mean, like we hear tov lehodot, we know lehodot, we hear that all the time. Livavenu, it's a very poetic form of our hearts. So she puts this at the beginning, both for those of us who really, you know, and for an Israeli hearing this, or for somebody who's fluent in Hebrew hearing this, then all the more so. These are the phrases that roll off the tongue because we use them so frequently. So it brings you in the first few lines, it creates this feeling that like, oh, this is serious prayer, right? It does not feel to anybody like, oh, this is something that somebody just wrote, you know, a couple of years ago. It feels like, oh, this carries the full weight of tradition. And so then as she goes forward, and as we get into these formulations that move more into the modern Hebrew way of saying things, or even using a word like demokratia, you know, using words that simply did not exist in the time that the rabbis were writing most of the prayers that we use today. By then, we've already sort of been brought into the sense of, but this is serious prayer, right? We're not starting with God heal our democracy, which, you know, we would be like, oh, wait a minute, there's something jarring there at the very beginning. She sort of lulls us into bringing in the more modern language. So there's a mix of the older and the newer, but it's done, I think, quite strategically to make sure that those of us who are reading it and those of us who are hearing it, if we do hear it or read it in Hebrew, immediately feel like this is no different than when we do the Amidah. This is no different than when we sing Tov Lehodot. It's using those pieces of language to bring us in. Any other questions? I'm going to scroll through and you can wave at me if you have a question, and I will try to actually see if there's anyone waving at me. Okay, I don't think I see any hands. Oh, wait, no, I do see a hand. Brian, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah. My question is, why is the prayer in two different sections, the top and the bottom, and sometimes at services we only read half? Why that division?
You know, it's interesting. It's a great question. I do not know why Rabbi Cohen chose to write it this way in this like two-part prayer. But I will say that after the first year or so, you know, we sort of decided that sometimes, you know, services can get very long, especially on a week when either there are lots of things to celebrate or lots of new mourners or a special occasion that, you know, involves an extra set of prayers. And so that some weeks it was easier to say, you know, let's do half of the prayer. And so it was very convenient that it was in two clear sections in that way. I think my suspicion is that, you know, just having more than one moment of using the Torah text, of bringing stuff from the prophets or from, you know, anywhere in the Tanakh, having more than one of those moments additionally kind of adds a little more seriousness to it. And so to have one in the middle and one in the end is, you know, simply like a nice way of balancing it out. So I suspect it was not something that Rabbi Cohen anticipated, being able to easily split it into different pieces. But it was very convenient that it was written that way, because it's been good for us to have it that way. Well, I want to thank you all. It's been lovely crashing your class, and I hope this was fun and useful. And you know, anytime you have any questions about anything that you come across in Hebrew, Rabbi Rapport and I love, as she said, nerding out over the Hebrew stuff. And she and I have different periods of Hebrew that we get nerdy about. So it's good to ask both. And I'm really thrilled to be here with you. So I wish you all a good week. Please do join us at 8 o'clock. I know I am much happier being in a room with this community than I am by sitting here by myself staring at other screens. So I hope I'll see you all at 8 o'clock. Thank you all.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Toda rabba. Take care all. So good to see you.